Welcome back to The Extraordinary Project. I'm Suzanne Clores. I'm still in Las Vegas, but I want to tell you a story about how much of a mind game this work can be once you step into it. How you can be a rational thinking person, and then one day, a perfect storm of a stranger, an email, and a trove of unresolved grief you didn't know you had can converge and change your truth forever. 2 years earlier, I had presented my own collection of extraordinary testimonies at a conference at Gettysburg College, not far from one of America's bloodiest battlefields. The theme of that conference was exploring the extraordinary, and the lectures definitely touched the outer reaches of my knowledge base. Topics like the anthropology of haunted places, ghost investigation techniques, and the veracity of something called EVP, or electronic voice phenomena. I'd never heard of that before. An EVP is a recording of a ghost voice, and to hear people talk about it academically is kind of riveting. Before you know it, you're plunging down this rabbit hole. One presenter, who was an expert in EVP, described how she had collected audio in a silent church built in 1692 in Essex, England. Investigators go to an old building, and they bring a handheld tape recorder, turn it on, and leave it running for an hour or so to see if they can pick up any spirit sounds. There's a theory, the stone tape theory, that the energy of traumatic events get trapped in the stones of the building in which they occur, and that they can be detected, even recorded, centuries later. As the researchers spoke, I was fascinated, but also guarded, because how can people think they're actually capturing recordings of ghost voices? Of all the possible sounds in an old building, water running through pipes, air moving through vents, how do you draw that conclusion? Then she played the recording, and I heard this guttural, very discernible sound that made my arm hair stand straight up. I looked at the researcher, her hands were on her hips, and I thought, that was not water running through a pipe. That really sounds like something alive. We call this one Chappie, she said. I felt sick. Could it be? I wanted to believe that it was static, but the sound of the voice raised questions about, well, everything. The world we can't see and will never see. The limits of our perception. Could some people perceive more than others? I sped away from the historic battlefield, swearing I would avoid this topic of hauntings in the future. Before this, ghosts were not on my personal radar. I never saw them or felt them, and I never thought about them. But now, let's just say I can never unhear Chappie. Anyway, it's a few years later, and I'm at this conference in sunny Las Vegas, and it has little to do with spirits of the dead, but I'm getting lecture overload. It was hours of discussion that questioned our understanding of time. Talks on futurism, dream psychology, light rays that didn't behave properly. So I go outside for some air. The sun takes up the whole sky, the heat swallows me. I'm standing in line now for fish tacos, and the lecture overload is about to fade away when I remember this one presenter's claim, and I get really angry. She said, rather offhandedly, "This all gets a lot easier to understand once you realize there's no such thing as past, present, and future." I'm carrying my fish tacos to an outdoor table, and I'm thinking, how could the average person ever accept this idea? Even if that theory is correct, it's no less annoying to hear. I mean, how can the average person enjoy their fish tacos when they realize the whole structure of their life is this charade? There are all these people sitting around me, enjoying themselves and laughing. I'm, jealous of their normal Las Vegas day, their freedom from ESP burden. But anyway, I go back inside to the ladies' room, and while I'm washing my hands, I encounter this elegant woman who I recognize because she was my table manager, and she asks me if she can give me this energy reading, which I guess is not that weird, considering I'm at an ESP conference. So I agree, and we part ways. I don't know how she's going to do the energy reading, but there were a couple of things about her that I immediately trusted. This might sound silly, but I liked how well she was dressed, and took note of her tiny diamond cross necklace, something I hadn't seen or worn since my Catholic school days. At a conference dominated by men, we were two women on the younger side of the demographic. She seemed to know all the presenters firsthand, and more importantly, she seemed to share my low tolerance for the foolishness typical of some psychic conferences. You know, people who want you to know that they have 14 past lives and can remember them all. It's like any conference anywhere. There are limits to who and how much you can handle. And for the record, I would never agree to let just anyone do an energy reading. But her sharp presentation and her tiny cross, she seemed fine, and I trusted I could extricate myself if things got weird. In the last few years, I had gotten good at that. A full day passed before I heard from her again. I had assumed she floated away and the deal was off. I was sort of relieved. But then, at the height of a terribly boring webinar, I received a text from the woman. I'll call her EL. She had just done my reading and would email me notes that night. I didn't get it. How had she done my reading when I hadn't actively taken part? If it was true and she had done the reading without me, the results could be more trustworthy. As all skeptics know, to sit in person for energy readings invites something called inferential cues. That means the sitter gives clues unknowingly, facial expressions, nods, and other affirmations, to either support or deny whatever the energy healer's narrative is, which the healer then builds into the session. Inferential cues are the source of most error in any type of energy work. They make the healing experience feel more authentic and true. But here, the opposite had just happened. EL had worked without my participation, with no inferential cues at her disposal, and I had felt nothing. So, was EL for real? I mean, was any of this for real? After dinner, I checked the 6 photographed pages she sent, curious. She had small feminine handwriting and careful loopy diagrams, and as I read, a rising disequilibrium rolled through me. The words maternal figure dominated the pages, with drawings and descriptions that resembled my very complex and deceased grandmother, Rose. Rose had been dead for 9 years, and I had never properly grieved her. She was a tough Italian Catholic lady. Think of a matriarch in a Ferrante novel, and add in equal parts Sicilian righteousness and a dash of Depression-era survivalism. Rose was on one hand a delight, and on the other, well, complicated. She picked fights with everyone, her sisters, her doctors, her husband, her friends. My own mother didn't speak to her for years. I believed, even after she died, that perhaps she suffered from more than just a hard life. According to EL, she surrounded me. To be honest, I didn't know what to do with the information. I read the notes. They were full of moving assurances, all the ones that you might expect. She loves you, she's so proud of you, she is here for you. And then this one. She's primarily on your right side. She wants you to call on her more. My vision blurred, and I could barely finish reading before I started crying. So, was EL not just an energy worker, but a real medium? The trouble was I never expected EL to channel the dead, and I was not prepared for the raw flood of memory. Rose adhered to the bottom line, and by her old age, had our whole family schooled in how best to respect her. When she was too sick to come to my wedding, my uncle, a wealthy man, flew on a private jet just to bring her a piece of wedding cake the next day. When she was in hospice a few months later, my husband and I drove hundreds of miles from Chicago to upstate New York so we could tell her in person that I was expecting. She died about a month later, but I had abandoned Rose emotionally, withdrew from her at a young age. I did not understand her marvelous strength and ferocity when it merged with her cruel letters and fierce temper. I had thrown out admiration for her near-obsessive work ethic, slow eating, tinkling laugh, and attention to the tiniest detail, and admitting this now filled me with grief. I went to bed, considering for a moment EL was hustling me. Not for money, but for empathy, attention, a brief stint of psychological dominance. Power games weren't out of the question at this conference any more than they were at a faculty meeting. I went to bed in this numb state of shock, and the next morning I woke up exhausted 45 minutes after the conference started and overwhelmed. The last 3 years writing about psychic phenomena had definitely stretched my view of human perception. But EL's reading moved the dial towards a whole new set of concerns. What is the critical thinking path? How do I properly discern message from metaphor without wearing full-on believer goggles? I was vaguely annoyed, and my thoughts wandered to Rose. She had not been a mysterious person. What was I supposed to do with this information? I couldn't really help it, but my mind jumped to Chappie, and the room tilted a little bit. I fought hard against that feeling that the floor was moving, that the walls weren't really there. I tried not to think about it, but I kept thinking, what if there really is no such thing as past, present, and future, and the dead are right next to us, all the time? I dressed and packed my suitcase. I don't know what any of this means, I said to the empty room. I don't know what I'm supposed to do next. I checked my email. A note came in from a colleague I hadn't heard from in 15 years. He was now a documentary producer interested in my work. Could it maybe translate to TV? Could we talk? I said I'd get back to him. And then I took a taxi to the conference, still thinking about the uncanny timing. This is what happens when you're in the world of the extraordinary. You start thinking, usually erroneously, about signs. You start linking two disconnected events, thinking that they're causal in some way. Most experts in the field agree this is a huge mistake. And although I willed myself not to think that the email had anything to do with the reading, it was really hard not to make that connection. When I found EL, I felt a curious tug of intimacy as we ventured outside to a private park bench, and it was a beautiful, hot, blazing June day. Usually, she sent people an audio file of her reading, but since we were in the same place at the same time, I agreed to speak to her in person to get more details. We spoke as if we had known each other for years, even though we had just met. I heard a cautionary voice within me. You don't know her. This could be her game, and you could be her mark. It's definitely not wrong to consider this voice, to approach situations like this with skepticism. But I've noticed one thing skeptics like to do, and it makes me wonder a little. It's to put themselves in the shoes of psychics and energy workers, plotting through how they would pull off such an emotionally manipulative stunt. They do this without actually acknowledging there is such a thing as energy work, believing only that people like EL are Machiavellian predators going in for a big mental con.
My name is Dr. Julie Beischel, and I'm the Director of Research at the Winbridge Research Center. I received my PhD in pharmacology and toxicology, but for the past 15 years, I've been applying what I learned with that hard science training to studying mediumship. When I was in graduate school, my mom committed suicide, and I hadn't really known anyone close to me that had died before, and so it made me start to wonder, and as a scientist, when you have a question, you apply science. And so I got a reading from a local medium, and it was evidential, and I thought, there's something here. And I had told some colleagues, and most of my colleagues were good scientists, and said, well, I don't really know anything about that, but it sounds like an interesting experience. But a couple of them was like, no, that couldn't have happened. Those people are all frauds and con artists, so you got duped.
There are con artists out there, of course. I've met plenty. But to think all energy workers, mediums, psychics, and clairvoyants are con artists, that's a fearful way out of a more complex conversation.
And I realized that that was a common opinion, and that people who had no data, who never looked into it at all, were making these grand claims. And I am not a fan of injustice, so I realized the mediums need a scientist to really bring the truth forward about what they can and can't do under controlled conditions.
One of the things Beischel talks about is how the choice to go see a medium is potentially life-changing.
Yeah. So there's a lot of things that the sitter can do to really optimize. The same thing as in research, you want to optimize the environment. So you want to be a good sitter, and you want to have invited your deceased person, and you want to have chosen the medium. Like, it's not something to go into lightly. Like, you wouldn't just go, I'm just going to get some therapy today. It's not a sideshow. It's not necessarily, it's not for entertainment. You shouldn't just walk into it. You're about to talk to someone who died, potentially, and that's going to have an effect on your psychology, and so you should be prepared.
When E.L. told me that Rose had come again and was asking to sit with us, I was honestly curious. What was she seeing and hearing? I looked beside her, even checked above her head for evidence of my little blonde grandma in a housecoat, and I saw nothing. As E.L. navigated a conversation with an invisible party, she didn't look anything like psychics on TV. No white eyeballs or neck twitches, only some gentle nodding and the look of listening. She was concerned about me. Is this freaking you out, she asked, that I'm having a conversation with her? There really wasn't anything to freak out about until she told me something sort of startling. She wants to enter my body. Is that normal? I said. She sighed, kind of weary. Sometimes. Rose is very insistent. If it's all right with you, I can let her in. Those believer goggles I was talking about, they were on. For a moment, all my objectivity dissolved into the hot desert sun. This is what everyone wished for dead loved ones to come back, to become a benevolent extract in the afterlife. I was overcome with the possibility that my grandmother wanted to talk to me, but then I worried. What if Rose's fierce self showed up? What if she was angry? E.L. looked misty for a moment before she met my eyes with her crystal blues. If you've ever been in a situation like this, there's really only one interesting choice. So I nodded my head and gave her permission, thinking she will either get this totally wrong or buckle under the wrath of Rose. My goggles were off, and I prepared myself for the end of the charade. E.L. started speaking. I love you, and I'm so proud of you, for all you've done, for how far you've come. Thank you, I say, holding back tears because maybe this is completely false. But, she smiled, you can do better. My breathing stopped. What did you say? You can do better. You can try a little bit harder. I know you work hard. But you can do a lot more. Do more. Use your voice. Toe the line. E.L. drew a line on the paper in front of her. Have better boundaries. I wasn't sure what to say. I didn't exactly feel reassured, more like vaguely chided. The mixed message of love and critique were strangely familiar. I wondered more about the mention of boundaries. Was it a generalization? Was she talking about my work life? With this project? E.L. sipped her water. She was on to something else. Now she's being silly. She's saying, the water is delicious. My mind returned to the email and whether this would make good TV. Where's the camera crew? E.L. said. Excuse me? She looked confused. Rose wants me to shout, where's the camera crew? Okay, E.L. said, amused. Where's the camera crew? She shouted, laughing. Where's the camera crew? Where's the camera crew? There were people walking by, resort employees and visitors. Everyone was looking at us. I was speechless. It seemed like this was a display of Rose's force of will, which quickly got out of control. A man walked by and looked at us strangely. E.L. cackled. Rose just told me, give that man a dirty look. The man ran away. Now she wants to walk around and see things. This is fun. Let's go over there, she's saying. E.L. had stood up. She's not exactly rude, but... E.L. looked as if she had been interrupted. Oh, I see. Spicy, she's telling me. I'm spicy. It was hard not to laugh. E.L. seemed genuinely amused and only a little addled by the continual request. Okay, again? Where's the camera crew? Where's the camera crew? Does this mean something to you? E.L. finally asked me. Are you getting the message? So most experts in the field agree the mind is wired to see patterns, to make meaning. But when you introduce phenomena that does not fit into the world of known science, that pattern-seeking habit leads you astray. Kind of like how people used to believe a meteor shower signified the end of the world. Usually, I was cautious about jumping to such conclusions. I wanted to keep these two incidents, the email this morning and EL screaming, "Where's the camera crew?" separate. But it was hard. The phrase seemed to directly reference that morning's email. Plus, she was shouting, not gently asking. That's exactly how Rose went about making her point. No matter how I sliced it, Rose was yelling at me to make a TV show. "Yes," I said, "I'm getting the message." And just like that, the goggles were back on. Then, in the next moment, the doubt came pouring in. My grandmother was a strict Italian Catholic. She would not waste my time or hers with a two-bit psychic. I mean, really, who was EL anyway? Was she well known? Was she legit? The answer really surprised me. She's a foot and ankle surgeon with a practice in the Bay Area. She has a family and a whole life. But what she said next was what really got me. My heart, she said, is really in Sicily. That would be the southern region of Italy. And here's what I thought was so funny about that. My grandmother was such a no-nonsense woman. It would be just like her to find an attractive female Catholic Sicilian doctor through whom to communicate with me, to tell me that she loved me, that I should work a little bit harder, and that I should get a camera crew. I boarded the airplane with my goggles off and have thought more than once that I would be wise to not take any of this literally, that it's much safer to see the experience as a giant metaphor for love and forgiveness and courage, probably a few other things too. Maybe EL's gift was more of an art form than an information system, or maybe it was both. I had to find out. The Extraordinary Project was created by me, Suzanne Clores. I wrote this episode and produced it with David Weiner, who wrote the music and made the mix sound so nice. Very special thanks to Julie Beischel, Donna Sinclair Hogan, Chappie, and of course EL.